What would happen if Luffy never went to Whole Cake Island? More specifically, what if Luffy went to Wano before going to Whole Cake Island? We all remember right before the Wano arc, Luffy made a detour to Whole Cake Island to retrieve Sanji. Zoro suggested that they leave Sanji and focus on taking down Kaido. Zoro figured that if they angered Big Mom, then they would have to deal with Kaido and Big Mom at the same time. And of course, Zoro was right. The raid on Onigashima drastically changed because of Big Mom's presence. But what if Luffy took Zoro's advice and decided to retrieve Sanji after defeating Kaido? How would the story change? Well, in this video, you are about to find out. Not only would the Wano arc have major changes, but the events that transpire on Whole Cake Island would change as well. So sit back, relax, and let's see what would happen if Luffy went to Wano instead of Whole Cake Island. So there are a lot of changes that are going to happen during the Wano arc. But before we get there, let's see what would change on Whole Cake Island. Of course, many things would stay the same as they did during the actual arc. Sanji sees his dad again and has a heartfelt reunion with his brothers. Yes, sarcasm is implied. Fights that happen during this arc, such as Luffy and Nami vs Cracker, and Luffy vs Katakuri obviously won't happen because Luffy won't be there. A lot of things would stay the same all the way up to the actual wedding. Sanji would still get the cuffs put on his hands to discourage him from escaping. He would still see Pudding's third eye and hear about the Big Mom Pirates' plan to eliminate the Vinsmokes. But here's the thing, Capone and his crew already have a plan to take out Big Mom during the wedding, by smashing the Mother Caramel portrait and causing Big Mom to freak out. This also leaves her very vulnerable to attacks. He also planned to use the combination of Brûlé and Caesar Clown to escape the wedding. I don't see Capone having a hard time capturing Brûlé on his own to use for his plan. Originally, Capone went to Luffy with this plan, and the two crews formed a temporary alliance. In this scenario, it would not make much sense for Capone to go to Sanji or the Vinsmokes with his plan, but that doesn't mean he still won't go through with it. During the wedding, the Big Mom Pirates would turn on the Vinsmokes. Sanji will still dodge the priest. Let's be honest, this guy is never hitting Sanji. And he would still dodge Katakuri's Jelly Bean attack. Capone would initiate his plan by breaking the picture of Mother Caramel. But just like during the Whole Cake Island arc, the mirror that Capone planned to escape with would get shattered. And Sanji would have to save his family like he did originally. Since Capone and his crew were in charge of security, they were the ones that took the Vinsmokes' raid suits. During the chaos, he would give the Vinsmokes back their raid suits and form a temporary alliance with them. This is where I believe Sanji will get his raid suit, and this time he will suit up alongside his family. Yes, Sanji hates the raid suit, but if his back is against the wall, he will use it. Jinbei will also change sides during this fight and fight alongside the Vinsmokes and the Fire Tank Pirates. And here is where everything goes downhill. Even with Big Mom out of commission, the remaining commanders are enough to defeat Sanji, the Vinsmokes, the Fire Tank Pirates, and Jinbei. Remember, Cracker is still active in this scenario, and he can make as many biscuit soldiers as he pleases. Smoothie and Katakuri are also active, and they have already proven themselves to be far above the Vinsmokes. Katakuri even off-screened Ichiji, which means that the Vinsmokes can still take damage even with their raid suits on. Even if they were lucky enough and the Tamate box went off and allowed them to escape the wedding, I don't see them being able to escape Big Mom's massive territory. Big Mom's territory is absolutely massive, and Whole Cake Island is at the center of it. Even when the Straw Hats arrived at Cacao Island, Peckham's told them that it would take another day of sailing before they reach Whole Cake Island, which just shows how big the territory actually is. Eventually, I see all of them being captured and stored into one of Montdore's books, and this is where their story would end. For now, at least. So with Sanji and Jinbei still on Whole Cake Island, that changes the Wano arc drastically. Now there are some good things that come out of this. Big Mom went all the way to Wano because of the events of Whole Cake Island. Without Luffy going to Whole Cake Island, Big Mom would stay on her territory, meaning when it comes to the raid, only Kaido would be on the rooftop, meaning a few of the matchups during the raid would have to change. But before we get to the raid, how would the rest of the arc change? A lot of Wano's Act 1 would remain the same. Luffy would be a bit weaker in general, since he did not have to fight Cracker, and more importantly, since he didn't get the break speed off of him by Katakuri. The Luffy and Katakuri fight was very critical for Luffy, giving him the time and practice he needed to learn Future Sight. So this version of Luffy would not have Future Sight at all. Luffy would fight Kaido at the beginning of the arc and, let's be honest, you know what happens here. Luffy would still have his rivalry with Kid, and pick up Rio Haki from Hyogoro. This would be where Big Mom breaks into the Udon prison, but since Big Mom is not in Wano, that isn't possible. This entire situation would be pretty interesting. Big Mom busted into the Udon prison whilst Kid and Killer were being tortured, and whilst Luffy was learning Rio Haki. But even without her, Luffy would still get out of this situation pretty easily. Luffy was able to free Hyogoro and himself from the explosive cuffs around their necks, pretty shortly after learning Ryo. On top of that, Raizo had already stolen the keys needed to free Luffy from the handcuffs. Since Luffy can free himself, Raizo could free Kid and Killer instead, meaning that Queen is going to be in a 1 vs 3 against Luffy, Kid, and Killer. Luffy with Ryo was able to damage Kaido, so to say that he would damage Queen is an understatement. Killer also has Sonic Scythes, which bypasses external defense, and Kid has his Awakening. Queen is getting bodied, and it's not close. Now there were 3 scenes that Sanji was a part of before we get to the raid. The first is Sanji's skirmish with Page 1. Page 1 and X-Drake were only sent out to hunt Sanji because he and Frankie attacked some of Orochi's men. Of course, if Sanji's not in Wano, that isn't going to happen. The second scene is the bathhouse scene, in which Sanji rescued Shinobu, Robin, and Nami from X-Drake and Basil Hawkins. There wasn't a fight here, and their goal was solely to escape. So even without Sanji present, I think they have a pretty high chance of escaping. Between Robin being able to create clones of herself, Nami is able to create mirages, and Shinobu is literally a ninja that could sneak up on Queen and King. Between all of their skill sets and abilities, they would escape even without Sanji being there to rescue them. And lastly is the skirmish between Sanji and X-Drake. This one isn't much of a straight up fight. In the anime, Sanji hit X-Drake, but in the manga he only dodged X-Drake's attacks, so there isn't much to discuss here. And then we finally get to the raid, and a lot of things here are going to change. Big Mom would no longer be on the rooftop to fight alongside Kaido. Big Mom was also the reason that Ulti and Page 1 were defeated, so someone else would have to take on that role. On top of that, without Sanji and Jinbei, Queen and Huzu would need new opponents. So after thinking about how this new raid would look, these are the new matchups based off of who is left. Luffy, Law and Kid versus Kaido, Marco versus Queen, Nekomamushi versus Ulti and Page 1, and X-Drake versus Huzu. The other fights such as Robin versus Black Maria, Zoro versus King, Frankie versus Sasuke, and Killer versus Basil Hawkins would still happen like they did originally. Now let's look at these new matchups. Starting in reverse order, we have X-Drake versus Huzu. Looking at the remaining people left on the Alliance's side, X-Drake was really the only option left to fight against Huzu. This fight is surprisingly close. We know Huzu's strengths from his use of the 6 powers techniques to give himself enhanced speed, enhanced defense, flight, and even projectiles, but X-Drake is surprisingly strong. Even when he was a kid, he was described as being very strong. On Sabaody, he was able to send a pacifist of flying with 1 attack in the manga and a few attacks in the anime. In contrast, it took Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji in their strongest forms attacking together to send a pacifist of flying. And even during the raid, X-Drake did a combined attack against one of the numbers alongside Luffy. Now combination attacks are pretty interesting because they imply relativity. Think of Luffy and Kid's attack versus the Marines at Sabaody, Zoro and Sanji's attack against King and Queen during the raid, and Big Mom and Kaido's combined attack on the rooftop against the Supernovas. This means that X-Drake's Excalibur technique is relative to Luffy's Gear 4th Kong gun. X-Drake also has an ancient Zoan fruit, which greatly boosts his overall defense. I shouldn't have to explain why being a literal dinosaur offers more defense than being an overgrown cat. X-Drake also took a finger pistol directly to the neck without armament haki. The 5 elders described Guernica as one of their best agents, and his attack was still unable to put down X-Drake. So in terms of overall defense and strength, X-Drake has the advantage. Huzu does outclass X-Drake in terms of speed and versatility, having multiple forms of ranged attacks and speed that could even give Jinbei some slight trouble. X-Drake's history within the Marines would help him a lot during this fight. Being a Marine and a member of Sword, X-Drake would be familiar with all of the techniques of the 6 powers. This fight could go either way in my opinion. I think X-Drake takes it, but if you think Huzu wins, I could see that as well. With Big Mom not in Wano, that means Perospero is also not in Wano, which frees up Nekomamushi for a fight. Now Nekomamushi versus Huzu might sound like the better matchup, but someone has to deal with Ulti and Page 1. Sure, other characters could help such as Usopp, Brook, and Nami, but none of them are damaging Ulti or Page 1. Nami would not have Zeus because in this scenario, the Straw Hats never went to Whole Cake Island. Usopp is Usopp, and Brook can at best temporarily freeze one of them before they eventually break out of the ice. This fight really comes down to Nekomamushi versus both Ulti and Page 1. And to be honest, he has this pretty easily. Nekomamushi and Inuarashi were both able to hold back Jack in their base forms back on Zou, and Jack is much stronger than Ulti and Page 1. Kaido even mentioned that Jack was not weak, but he also called Doflamingo weak, and we know how strong Doflamingo is. Luffy was casually styling on both Ulti and Page 1 and was about to obliterate Ulti with Gear 4 before Yamato saved her. Yes, you heard that right, because Luffy in Gear 4 with Ryo Haki could even damage Kaido, so he would easily beat Ulti and Page 1 in Gear 4. Going back to Nekomamushi, in his base form he is more than enough for both of them, and once he goes into his Sulong form, it isn't a fight anymore. Nekomamushi will win. Now let's say we swap those 2 fights, and had Nekomamushi versus Huzu instead, and X-Drake versus Ulti and Page 1. Nekomamushi versus Huzu was a battle of the cats. May the best cat win, and spoiler alert, it's this one, and it's not close. I really shouldn't have to explain how much of a not fight this is. Nekomamushi wins. Now X-Drake versus Ulti and Page 1 is pretty simple. In a 1 vs 1, X-Drake is beating any of them. But in a 2 vs 1, Ulti and Page 1 would win. So even if Huzu beats X-Drake, it doesn't really matter. Either way you look at it, all roads end at Nekomamushi. And if you're wondering why Yamato is not in any of these fights, it's because she has a very important role during the arc, freezing the explosives to stop the entire island from going boom. And that is pretty important. So in this scenario, she would still be doing that in the background. With Sanji still at Whole Cake Island, the natural replacement for him is Marco. Marco stepped aside to let Sanji and Zoro fight King and Queen, but in this scenario, he would fight instead. With Zoro still fighting against King in this scenario, Marco will have to fight Queen. This fight is pretty straightforward. I know people love to downplay Marco, but let's not pretend this fight is competitive. Marco soloed both King and Queen, so fighting Queen in a 1 versus 1 is going to be much easier. I know some people think this fight is competitive, but it really isn't. Marco stomps, and this isn't a debate. And finally, the final and most important fight, Luffy, Law and Kid versus Kaido. You might be wondering why Killer and Zoro aren't here as well, and it is simple. Zoro still has to fight King, and Killer still has to fight Basil Hawkins. Think about it this way. In this scenario, instead of going up to the rooftop, Killer and Zoro immediately start their fights against King and Basil Hawkins instead. Now some of you might be scratching your head and saying, we already saw this fight. And that is half true. Kaido did have Big Mom to back him up during that fight, but in this scenario, that would change. In this scenario, Law and Kid would use their awakenings against Kaido, and Luffy would also learn Advanced Conquerors, but more importantly, Luffy would also awaken his Devil Fruit and get Gear 5th. Now Kaido is stupidly durable and has insane endurance, but I think this combination would be too much, even for him. Kaido does have his Magma Dragon form, but many of the captain's best techniques don't need to make physical contact to be effective. On one hand, Kaido would have to contend with Kid's Assign and the Damned Punk, as well as Law's Punctually and Shock Willy, which both bypass external defense and deal internal damage. And then he has to deal with Luffy in Gear 5th using Advanced Conqueror's Haki. That is GG's, even for Kaido. I see the 3 captains walking away with the win. Now that is how I think the Wano and Whole Cake Island arc would look if Luffy went to Wano instead of Whole Cake Island. But we are not done quite yet. This video is only part 1, and the follow-up is going to be, what if this new version of Luffy sailed straight into Big Bomb's territory to rescue Sanji? If you are interested in that, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. Otherwise, you can check out my most recent video about the mysterious mural in chapter 1138. Other than that, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.